Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Good morning from Rome. And here's Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Morning, Geoff. Where are you?
I'm in a park with my son, who's sleeping next to me in his pram. So I suggest we get cracking, guys.
Absolutely. Here's Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Morning, Andy. Where are you?
Good morning from Ainsley Park Leisure Centre in Edinburgh. I'm in the gymnastics hall, but my oldest daughter has got her swim training next door. The swimming pool's a little loud, as listeners will realise, so I'm in a very quiet gymnastics hall with parallel bars right behind me.
Great. Yeah. Good.
Can I just say, guys, very quickly, for our benefit of our friends on YouTube, have a look at this. This is the park, and look at that. That's the first tee at Deeside Golf Club. Par 3. A nice sort of 8-iron, 9-iron on a good day like this, benign conditions. Play it to the front of the green and lot, just feed into the hole. Beautiful. There you are.
There you go. Our golf correspondent.
I mean, that's how you're meant to play it. There's also the clubhouse on the right where I've shanked it too many times.
We'll have more from our golf correspondent throughout the podcast. Thank you very much for finding us. The reason we're here from all over the place, in more ways than one, is because, of course, we are reacting to the result overnight in Hamilton. Scottish Labour have defeated the SNP and won the Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse by-election. Reform UK finished in third. Labour's Davy Russell got 8,559 votes. The SNP's Katie Loudon got 7,957, and Ross Lammy from Reform UK was on 7,088. Of course, it's less than a year to the Scottish Parliament election. The Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar says the result proved the pundits wrong. He's probably got a point, hasn't he, Geoff? Are you surprised? Are you shocked by Scottish Labour's victory?
Yes, absolutely. And I thought that the prevailing narrative, particularly, not just the narrative, but the evidence that we had to date in terms of the two local by-election in the Greater Glasgow area recently, in Clydebank Waterfront in Glasgow East, where the Labour Party were well beaten by the SNP, and in one of those contests, I think it was Clydebank Waterfront, they were pushed into third place. You've also got the spectre of the local election results in England, and all national polling saying that the Labour were on the slide. So this is a huge victory for Anas Sarwar, and it totally changes the narrative going into 2026. I mean, if I may just develop that very quickly, because we've got to be quick today. John Swinney wanted to come out of this contest and say only the SNP can clearly take on Reform and win. You know, we're the party that can defeat them. Now Anas Sarwar can take that territory away from John Swinney and say, when it really matters in a parliamentary election, by-election, when we're facing parliamentary elections in less than a year, I'm the party that can take on Reform and win. A stunning result. Well done to Anas Sarwar. Well done to Davy Russell. Not without his critics in this contest, and we covered that on our own podcast. So nothing but a fantastic result. Reform are key players in this election coming forward. That's clearly the second story, in my opinion, and the SNP have a hell of a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Andy, your take, let me just give you the percentage of the vote as well, because I think this is interesting. So Labour, 31.6%, the SNP, 29.4%, Reform UK, 26.1% of the vote, and then you get down to the Conservatives on 6%, the Greens, the Lib Dems, and others below that.
So there are bits. I mean, this is a big shock. There is no question about it. There's no doubt that pollsters and I dare say pundits like ourselves will take a bit of a shellacking today in some quarters. Labour will be gleeful, and fair enough, they probably deserve to be. But there's no question this is a big shock. And the reason, to be fair to pollsters and others, the reason it's a big shock is that Labour have massively outperformed their polling here. So Labour polled a vote share of 35% in last year's general election. Their average polling vote share at the moment is down to about 21. They're about 14 points down in the polls, and yet they've massively outperformed that here. The SNP's vote share performance here was roughly what you would expect based on polling. And Reform have slightly outperformed, largely because they've pretty much taken every Tory unionist vote that there is, and the Tories have been completely decimated. So the big story here is not really necessarily what Reform polled and what the SNP polled, which is roughly on expectation. maybe slightly out of expectation for reform. The big story here is Labour totally outperforming expectation. And the big question, therefore, is actually why have they outperformed expectation, particularly in a contest which was framed by the SNP in particular as an SNP versus Reform contest. It's really, really interesting, and I have to say, totally unexpected.
Do you know something very quickly? Anas Sarbar will be well within his rights, right? To take to a lectern when he's addressing the media today to just give it, the big one. Just sort of say, John Swinney, Nigel Farage, all the commentary at Professor John Curtis, those idiots at Holyrood Sources. Your boys took one hell of a beating.
Anas will probably be listening to this. Good morning, Mr. Sarwar. Feel free to mention the podcast from the lectern today. That'd be very welcome, in whatever capacity.
Calm down, Geoff. You're going to wake the boy up. Calm down.
I know.
I mean, it is huge. Right, let me bring in some instant reaction from our friend Mark McGan, who emailed at 5 o'clock this morning to share his thoughts. He says, firstly, while Labour's vote held up better than expected, they did go backwards versus 2021, which was their worst ever Scottish Parliament election.
Yeah.
Says, well, as Sir John Curtis pointed out, the result was basically within the margin of error of what the national poll suggested for the SNP and Labour. The closeness and the fact Labour won suggests that the disproportionate 60-seat result being projected for the SNP based on current polling is incredibly fragile. And his third point for you to consider, Reform significantly outperforming their polling without the kind of collapse in turnout that was expected. Turnout was actually pretty decent, wasn't it, in all of this? He says it would be great to get your early thoughts on these, Geoff.
Well, very quick thoughts. I agree with Mark, and we've played the psephology game before, and I'm not going to. I'll bow to his judgment. I think, and it actually reflects what Andy just said. In all honesty, in his opening remarks, I think the most fascinating thing going forward is what does this mean for Holyrood 2026? I mean, look, this is a one-off. By-elections can take on kind of. Characters of their own in many senses, but in terms of the wider plot, what does this mean for the for the election? If this was to be replicated in any way, we're going to have an absolute hodgepodge of a parliament, a rainbow parliament that's going to require serious horse trading to get a legislative programme through. But I say again, Anas Sarwar is now in the position, in my opinion, because his colleagues down south are taking a hammering from Reform. He can turn around them and say, look, I know how to beat Reform. I've just done it. Would you start listening to me a bit more, please? Get your elbows out, son, and say, listen, I can help you win. Does this mean that he has an elevated position within Westminster politics in terms of what the Labour Party are doing in government down there? So I think that's the other thing that I would like to explore. But in terms of Mark's analysis, I couldn't agree more. I mean, Reform are players. They've outperformed. SNP's vote fragile. Labour have particularly outperformed. What does this mean for 2026? It's utterly fascinating. There's never a quiet day in Scottish politics, boys. This is really good. And by the way, we as a trio were wondering what to call our big event at the end of the month with John Swinney and Anas Sarwar, and we're like, can we call it the Battle for Bute House? Because it looks like John's a stick-on. It certainly is a battle for Bute House right now, by the way.
It certainly is. It certainly is. Can I throw this at you as well? This is from Patrick Maguire, who is chief political commentator at The Times. He is so plugged into the Labour machine. And he tweeted in the middle of the night, and I've nicked it. He says, after the Glasgow Garskaden by-election in 1978, Donald Dewar said, this changes the whole psychological climate of Scottish politics. And as I think we're getting at here on this podcast, Patrick says you could surely say the same tonight. Andy, it is about narrative, but you pick up on some of Mark's points as well and what Geoff's saying there. But this is a huge boost for Scottish Labour.
It is a huge boost, but Anas Sarwar's not going to overread this. I mean, he'll be obviously elated this morning, but Anas is very smart, and he gets the fact that they're still in the mud here. I mean, they're still in trouble here. He will not overread this by-election result. As Mark said in one of the parts of his email, the percentage has gone down since 2021. So a big boost for them, a big surprise, but they won't overread it. I think that they'll all be all the parties will be quite reflective this morning. Clearly, Anas Sarwar will think, okay, we are definitely still in the game here. So what can we do now? Let's and it'll be a big psychological boost for them, no question about that at all. It'll change the type of coverage they get in the media and the sort of attention they get as well, which is good for them for sure. I think I'd be interested in John Swinney's thoughts this morning, I've said a couple of times before in the last few weeks in this podcast, and I think it's worth labouring, that I felt the programme for government was an agenda of a government and a party that already thought it had everything pretty much sewn up.
Yeah.
It was very, very safe. It didn't really do much to tackle some of the big issues, and it looked to me like they kind of knew that they didn't have to because they didn't feel there was a huge amount of competition for them. I just wonder this morning if they're sitting thinking to themselves, we didn't know that we had a battle on here, and maybe we do. I'm sure I don't think for a second that John and those around him would admit that that's what they were thinking. But psychologically, I just wonder if it will also require the SNP just to pull their finger out a little bit here and say we've actually got a bit more to do.
Pull your finger out a little bit. I'm sorry, what have we been saying throughout this entire podcast for the last few months is that John has to be bold. He has to now face this situation as if he's losing the next election. Him and Kate need to get in a room and say, look, we're losing. We are now losing this election. That's how you've got to fight the next 10 months. We're losing. So what are we going to do to try and arrest that and change that? And, I'll give you one example. I heard a briefing, I'm sure you heard the same, Andy, that there might be a reshuffle coming up in the Scottish Government, and John was going to tinker around the edges. It was going to be pretty safe, not huge changes. Well, I think you might have to revisit that. There's a perfect example of trying to evidence that you're listening to the people, the electorate out there, and that you're changing course. So not just a little bit of the finger out, a lot of the finger out.
The whole finger. Let's not go too far down that line.
Let's change
Move
that
on.
reference, I think.
Move on.
Yeah, let's.
We're going to be on after the watershed.
We've been talking, of course, about Reform UK's place in all of this, and I'm trying to think, throughout the course of the campaign, we were saying it's a little bit dull, it's a little bit boring. Nigel Farage's visit definitely injected a bit of whatever it is, a bit of drama perhaps in the last few days. But surely there are questions for him about whether the racism row around this ad that they were running was actually helpful in Labour winning. And if Farage's tactics here just didn't really pay off, perhaps it's too soon, but there's got to be questions about how the campaign was fought by these parties, doesn't there?
But the problem on that, Calum, is that as Mark McGahan's just outlined and Andy said already, they outperformed.
Yeah.
So they'll turn around because you're coming from such a low base for Reform and you've got very little to compare with. They'll just say a very strong result. This proves we are absolutely challenging. We're a genuine alternative at Holyrood. So the analysis on whether the advert worked or not is irrelevant. That will not take place in this discourse, nor should it really, because frankly nobody can answer that question fully. The fact is they outperformed. They came a strong third, almost a close second. And they're in the game now. They're very much a consideration ahead of Holyrood elections next year.
And let me throw one more thing in as well, which again will be something that the pollsters are going to have to try and go over in a little bit of detail here. And by the way, let's defend the pollsters. Their job is to take a snapshot of opinion in time. It's not actually to predict elections. And so, I think they do I think they do well to take a snapshot of opinion in time. But what they're going to have to do is try to work out where some of these Reform votes came from. Because we've talked quite a lot about how the SNP appeared to be pretty impervious to Reform and how they were pretty much the only party that wasn't losing votes to Reform. But just look at the numbers here, guys. Reform got a percentage of the vote that can't be explained by just taking Tory votes. Can't be, because it's nowhere near enough Tory votes to give Reform that sort of number. It can't be explained by taking Labour votes because Labour didn't lose that many votes. So it's very difficult to look at those numbers and not conclude that Reform have taken some SNP votes here. Now, if that is the case, then that is new and unexpected, and that will need a lot of further exploration, I think.
Yeah, fair point. Then we come to this, I suppose. Davy Russell, the Labour candidate. Geoff, you said at the start, not without his critics. Of course, we've been reflecting that. But is this then a template for next year? And it's perhaps things that listeners to this podcast might be familiar with. A local campaign, local issues, a local candidate, hugely underestimated by others, didn't take part in a TV debate, much to everyone's disgust. He still wins.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I say again, by-elections are fairly unique things. Hamilton is no stranger to unique results. If we think about the famous 1967 victory in Hamilton by Winnie Ewing. So I don't know if you could read too much into that. I think, if you were to ask Anna Sarwar privately, would you prefer your candidate to go on telly and defend his position and promote his position? He'd say, aye, I would. So, I don't think that's a winning formula, but I do think your point about local candidates who understand, who are in the constituency, understand the challenges, understand the opportunities that they see in their local community is a very, very important one. Look, let's not get too excited here about what this all means. But I think the biggest takeaway for me, as I said at the top of the programme, is the narrative has completely changed. And this gives Anna Sarwar something to grab onto and build from. And the converse of that is John Swinney is now looking around going, what the hell do I do?
Let me feed in. So I've tweeted just while we've been recording this morning just to get some thoughts from you, of course, on Twitter. So a couple of these for you. Fraser says, the John and Kate recovery appears to exist mainly in the Holyrood bubble. People are fed up in the real world. The SNP have to find something to campaign on next year, as the domestic record of NHS, education, ferries, the A9, the A96 is being repeatedly and rightly punished, says Fraser. Fraser Wallace, that is, because a different Fraser, Johnston, says, undoubtedly pollsters and pundits underestimated the local impact. Sarwar asked some clever questions in FMQs yesterday on the neonatal unit on the day of the by-election. It exposed there was more nuance to the claim that simply the SNP were shutting it down. And Tommy makes the point, he actually asks about, Andy, about your assertion on the SNP and losing votes to reform, which we've actually already mentioned. But he says the pro-UK vote share doesn't exactly scream independence now either. Says Tommy. Andy, any of that, or Geoff, you want to pick up on?
Yeah, I tell you one thing that that is pretty important in that context, actually. It's easy to get caught up in the Holyrood bubble. And, we may not be quite in the bubble, but we're bubble adjacent, us three. We're bubble adjacent. And the Holyrood bubble certainly tells the story that the SNP is now a completely different animal because of the fact that John Swinney and Kate Forbes are running it. And there's a lot of good reasons to suggest that, because they are very different to what came before them, and they are capable of a lot. The big problem, I think, for John and Kate here is there's a massive difference between words and action. And people like us, we analyse words, but voters vote based on action. And if you look at the Scottish Government now under John and Kate and the Scottish Government 2 years ago before they took over, what on the ground in people's lives, what is actually different yet? Not very much. Anything, actually? It's different. It's a different narrative. We who operate in this world, we know they are different people who think different things and want to do different things. But in terms of actual action on the ground, nothing really has changed. And that may just be the biggest Achilles heel that John and Kate have here.
Yeah,
I'm just going to...
sorry.
No, go on, Geoff.
Yeah, I agree a lot with what Andy has said, although I will defend us to a certain degree in this respect, because I've never been overly enamoured by the actions, as you put it, Andy, of the SNP since John and Kate took over. Yes, the prevailing narrative, mood music, all that sort of stuff is a steadying of the ship, but I do want to see more deliberate and bold actions in terms of their policies. And listen, as I said earlier, they've got to fight this like, well, we're screwed if we don't do it. So now we've got to start ripping off the Band-Aid and starting taking some tough decisions. John's done very well to try and keep the party together and have a more consolidated, united position. But sometimes, as Andy again has pointed out, that's speaking to your own folk and nae to the folk on the doorsteps.
Just a very final thought from me then on this, just to put to you as we wrap up our immediate reaction to this result, Scottish Labour winning the Hamilton by-election, is on Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, who didn't campaign in the constituency, despite being just down the road, announcing the Strategic Defence Review earlier in the week. But then also, and when it comes to considering where the narrative goes from here, the winter fuel payment allowance reversal or tweak or whatever it's going to turn out to be, it sounds like it might be taxing wealthier pensioners to claw back some of the money that is given to them in winter fuel allowance. That's likely to be announced later this year, maybe just a few months before the Scottish parliamentary by-election. Is there a chance, Andy, that the Labour government at Westminster can still positively impact the narrative for Anas Sarwar heading into May next year? We've been talking a lot about how they've negatively impacted it over the last few months. Actually, do they still have quite a lot of influence here?
Yeah, I absolutely think they do. I mean, this has bucked the trend a little bit, and it's a by-election, as we've said, so it's a bit weird in terms of how people vote. But it stands to reason that if the Labour government at Westminster can effectively create such a massive downturn for Scottish Labour, as the polls have indicated, and that's what all the polls have said, then it stands to reason that they can also create some sort of upturn. Whether they can create the same sort of upturn, so that the curve ends up being just as high as it was last year, I'm not entirely sure about that. But yeah, for sure, a better performance by Labour at Westminster will help Labour at Holyrood, because to a large degree, people will still vote based on what's happening at Westminster and not what's happening at Holyrood. So yeah, for sure, that's possible. But is it likely? I'm not convinced. I mean, I think it's easy to trash yourself, but it's much more difficult to pick yourself back up.
Yeah, fair point. John Curtis said on this podcast at the start of this year that the 2026 election would be a blame election. Who do the public blame for where things are at? And I still think that's true, isn't it, Geoff? That's what we're looking at here. This by-election suggests the people in Hamilton are blaming the SNP and they're going with Labour.
Yeah, I agree with John's analysis, of course. I mean, Anas Sarwar is just going to absolutely double down on the narrative he took through this by-election and just say things are not getting better under the SNP. They've had generations to improve things, and they're not. That's what he's going to say. John's going to try and defend that point. Your kind of challenge around the UK government is central to all of this, of course. How the UK government is viewed at the point of people going to the polls in May will still have a lot of bearing on how people eventually put their cross in which box in their ballot paper. So, we've got the spending review next week. Will there be some good news for Scotland on that? Hearing some murmurs that there's some positive things that Anas Sarwar might be able to welcome. But I'm more interested in Anas Sarwar's role here. I mean, surely to goodness, if you're a strategist at UK Labour saying, how's he managed to do this and we can't? And I just wonder if he's got a bigger role in helping to shape Westminster policy.
Here's one final thought. I think that we obviously don't, nobody quite knew what public opinion was in this constituency. Okay, and if that means that people don't quite know what public opinion is throughout the country, then that poses some quite interesting challenges for the parties, because reputations are lost in miles and gained in inches. It's much more difficult to get it back. And if the parties are already chasing public opinion that they don't actually understand, and this goes for Labour and the SNP, then it may already be too late.
Thank you so much. Really good to get your instant reaction. Of course, lots more to come out over the next few days, weeks and months. We do have our event. It's the Battle for Bute House. We've got John Swinney and Anas Sarwar sitting down with 120 of you. Actually, we've sold out already at Johnny Walker and Princes Street, supported by Diageo and sponsored by Made to Be Measured from the Scotch Whisky Association. That's happening on the 25th of June. As a podcast listener, you will of course hear it that week as well, even if you're not in the room for the live recording that night. It's just taken on a whole new significance. We're really looking forward to that. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of the Holyrood Sources podcast. We'll be back in your feed again next Wednesday, and we'll speak to you then.